When we are comparing the cloud to other alternatives, we often start with a conversation about cost. When we are comparing the cloud to other alternatives, we often start with a conversation about cost. And when we speak with customers who come to us at Tekspace and say, hey, we want to migrate, usually there's an impetus for that conversation. Something has happened, and usually it's kind of painful. They say, okay, well, there's warranties that are expiring and we need to repurchase all of our hardware, or some software licensing is going out of date, or maybe people aren't as productive as they could be. And they're considering the cloud against a number of other different alternatives. There's the hybrid cloud, public cloud, which is AWS, or staying the same. Usually that means staying on-premise or staying in a data center. But almost always, these customers are at a fork in the road. And the reason that it's important to be able to get a really good understanding of what the cost of the cloud might be is because you don't want to find yourself, 6 months down the track or a year down the track looking at your balance sheet and thinking, maybe we've made a mistake because the cost projections that we put together are, completely wrong. And maybe we should have made a different decision when we're back at that fork in the road. The purpose of today's conversation, what we're going to cover off, are a couple of different things. We're going to look at, the common pitfalls and traps that people fall into when they're looking at cost in the cloud, and the internal barriers they might face, but also a sort of loose methodology about how we help our customers going about working out what their costs are and what they might be. Now, it's going to be really difficult for us to put some really solid numbers against what the cost of the cloud might be because every customer is different and what they do with the cloud changes. So it's going to be difficult to say, well, the cloud costs X amount of dollars, but we can help you sort of think about building a framework that you can use in your own businesses to get there. And it starts with working out today's total cost of ownership. So let's say you buy a car, right, and the car's $20,000 for argument's sake. A lot of people think, well, the cost of the car is $20,000. But total cost of ownership is actually the full cost of owning that car. It's not just the $20,000. It's the cost of fuel. It's the cost of maintenance and the skills and the people that you need to make sure that car is running smoothly. It could be the tolls, and it could even be, you might even consider costing in depreciation of that asset over its lifetime. And when we think about IT, it's kind of similar. We want to work out what all of the factors are that contribute to cost. And the reason we do this first is not only to work out what, a baseline of what today's actually costing us is, but because it exposes detail in the balance sheet that we might not think about otherwise. What we then do is we look at those other pathways at the fork in the road, and we use the information we've gleaned from working out today's TCO to think about what the cost of those alternatives might be. And then we compare all of that information against the pros and cons of each option, the benefits and the drawbacks. So I guess what are the contributors to total cost of ownership in IT? So the way we think about costs at IT, they sort of really drop into three different buckets. At the center of it all are the systems. This is typically what people think of IT as being sort of in the same analogy as the car, right? You got your computing power, some place to store stuff, maybe some networking and so on, some warranties. And then outside of that, there's the operational expenditure that sort of is used to, the services that support that infrastructure. Electricity, cooling, data links. And then around outside of that are people, right? The capability that's required to support the services and the systems that we use in our IT to work every day. But often there are a number of intangible costs that people don't quite consider when they think about the cost of IT. The first is loss of productivity. If IT is not working optimally, it's costing you inefficiency and productivity. And when your systems fail and they're customer facing, you lose reputation as well, and there's a cost to that. These are things that are hard to measure but are very real. And anyone who's been close to the coalface of IT can see this as well. When you have laggard systems, it's really difficult to have a culture of innovation, and this is something that AWS talks a lot about in their own ethos and their own principles. But it's difficult to create new things, find new value, and find new opportunities in technology. When your infrastructure doesn't scale with your business, and I'm just talking about as it grows, but also as it condenses, there's a cost to that as well. When those same systems aren't working and they create a poor experience for your own staff and your own people, maybe this isn't the catalyst that is the reason that someone might leave your organization, but it's a contributing factor. Systems don't work well, can't get enough done, I feel like I'm a cog in the machine. And lastly, the traditional procurement model, or the way we go about buying IT. And we'll speak to this in a second, but essentially the way that we do things traditionally is that we try and project what we might need 3, 4, 5 years from now, spend a huge amount of money up front to buy all of that capability, and the likelihood of getting it right is really low. And the reason it's really low is, I guess there's a couple ways to look at it. There's two sides of the same coin. The white line here is our sort of planned capacity. This is what we've bought our IT for, to handle, right? And we think our business is going to grow, so we've planned to buy IT systems that can cater for that growth. The challenge, though, is that demand is fluid. And whenever demand exceeds capacity, often what that means is that you end up with downtime, or at least systems that are slowing down. And whenever we're not using that capacity, we're essentially wasting our resources, because this is capacity that perhaps we shouldn't have bought, right? And one of the great benefits of the cloud is that capacity scales with demand. And because capacity can scale with demand, and capacity is the primary driver for cost in the cloud, your investment also scales up and down over time. When we speak with customers about a move to the cloud, what we found is that typically there's someone in the organization who sort of leads that initiative to move the organization. And what we found is that oftentimes these people find it difficult to not only communicate but sell these intangibles to the people who make the financial decision making. And the reason that is what we think is that there's actually three drivers behind that. The first is the initiative owner's understanding of what these intangibles are and how they intrinsically link with the organization's mission and values and goals. The second is their ability to communicate to the leaders of the business. So even if they really do deeply understand it, they may not be able to deliver it in a way that's understandable. And the last is essentially the competency of the leader. And their ability to interpret what's being said, receive the information, and agree that there is value in these intangibles and getting them right. And this is quite a problem, because 75% of CFOs in organizations are the people who make IT decisions. Okay? Now, this is compounded when you consider that 45% of CIOs report in to the CFO. So how is this person who owns this cloud initiative going to be able to sell the idea of the cloud internally when these are the sorts of people that are making choices? The move to the cloud is as much a disruptor for these financial decision makers as it is for everyone else in the organization. And as much as it will transform the way that you work and how productive you might be and the opportunities for you to innovate in the future, it also transforms the balance sheet. So for the CFO, the impact is quite real. This is sort of typically what an IT budget looks like. Okay? For the most part, it's sort of flat, but there are big lumps every few years. And maybe your balance sheet isn't this simple, and maybe there are lumps that sort of happen more often. But what we see is that organizations who are part of this traditional procurement model, who are purchasing IT up front, paying for the hardware, getting the warranties in order, buying the software licensing, they tend to clump together. Okay? And what this means is that when the CFO is planning out their budget, they plan for these lumps to come along. And in fact, something that we do at Tekspace is help them model those costs out over time, which is how we have this insight. When the cloud comes along, these numbers start to flatten out. You still have a lot of the OPEX that happens as part of a normal IT environment or IT department. There's still going to be people who need to service it and so on, and these are typically operational expenses, but there's none of this lumpiness anymore. Now, what this means for the CFO is that even if the cost of the cloud over that same time period, 5 years, is less, the annual spend can be more. And they need to understand these intangibles, and they need to understand these benefits, A, to be convinced that this is the right way to go to begin with, but B, to be able to communicate it with their peers or the board or whoever it is that they need to go to get the stamp of approval to increase the annual budget. And oftentimes the cost of the cloud is actually greater than what their traditional IT costs might be, which is why understanding and considering these intangibles is so critical. When we consider these intangibles and I guess the intangible benefits of the cloud and also the intangible costs, the effective cost of the cloud tends to decrease. You're still spending the same amount, but you're seeing benefits elsewhere because you're innovating, because you're creating new lines of business, because you're being more efficient. What you might notice too is that this flat line is sort of trending downwards. And one of the reasons that we see this trend downwards, even if the initial cost of the cloud is higher, is because of the way that the cloud, I guess there's this CapEx to OpEx idea, but there's the way that the cloud is designed to actually reduce your costs over time. And something that AWS pushes a lot and encourages Tekspace, us as partners, to do is to drive the cost of the cloud down for our customers. And we do this in a number of ways. Firstly, it's a pay-as-you-go model. So if you spin up a system and decide you don't want it in a year's time, you can turn it off and you stop paying for it. In a traditional IT procurement or IT environment model, what you do is you've bought this capacity to run the system, and if you decide you don't want to run it anymore, now you've got to find something to do with the server. Otherwise, essentially, it's just sitting there doing nothing. With the cloud, that's not the case. So you can more sort of tightly match your infrastructure with your needs. The second is the use more, save more principle. And this here is where, particularly for storage and data transfer, you follow a tiered pricing model, and the rate decreases as you use more of it. And lastly, cost optimization, which is something we do really heavily, and we help our customers in this all the time. In fact, I haven't seen an example where we haven't been able to save our customers money. But there are a number of different methodologies you can use to significantly drive down the price, even as much as 70% in some cases. Now, I've mentioned that we do 3-year budgeting at Tekspace to help our customers model out their costs with IT. This is more than just our cost to you, but also everything else as well that sits around it. Your AWS services, your data links, software licensing that you might need, desktop refreshes. We sit down with you and we help you plan this out. Now, if you're a business leader, this is helpful because maybe you don't have someone in the business that can do that for you and that has the knowledge of what you might need to expect that's coming up in the future. And if you're an IT leader, the same thing is really valuable because you've now got this really well thought through document that you can take to decision makers inside the business to help them communicate what your plans are and what they should be thinking about for the future of IT. Thank you.